Okay, so you should see my screen now. A couple of quick announcements too, and just the way that this is organized, so that we can try to be as efficient as possible. It is broken up into two pieces. As many of you may know, there are several sessions on both campuses throughout the week for the revised placement by itself. So we are going to start with waitlisting today, and then if you do feel the need for kind of a deeper dive on the placement piece from an advising perspective, feel free to join any of those other sessions, and then can field questions on waitlisting at those as well. But the first topic today will be waitlisting. And after each of these sections, I have some places built in for questions. So if you can try to hold until those points, we'll try to get as many of those answered as possible. All right, so anybody who's been with Neosho for a while is familiar with our current waitlisting process. Really revolves around a student looking at a clock and waiting for a spot to open. As I mentioned, there's been a subgroup of the Enrollment Management Committee who's been working for a couple of years on implementing a waitlisting process and have made a lot of progress over the last semester or two. So are planning to make that live for summer and fall enrollment. So today we're going to go over some of the testing that we've done and how we anticipate that will work. In the past, it's been a very manual process. If we have had students interested in a waiting list, it's a matter of explaining to them how to kind of monitor the course search and openings for seats themselves and who to contact and when that seat is available. So this is a more automated process, thankfully, and we'll go over that step by step here. So how will waitlisting work? First, the student or the advisor working together is going to add a course to the waitlist. I'll share some screenshots as we get farther along here. This is just kind of an intro slide here. So they add to a waitlist of the course. It will then show in a separate waitlisted section. Once that has taken place, a student who is next on the waitlist will be notified when a spot has been made available in the course. That could be because a student was dropped for non-pay or decided not to attend for that semester. That student is then given 24 hours from the receipt of that email to take action, so to speak. So that could either be moving themselves to current or leaving the wait list. And then once that 24-hour period has passed or the student has taken action, it will go on to the next student if there's another seat available. So failure to act results essentially in that student then being dropped from the wait list and an email being facilitated to the next. So the way I've broken this up is kind of the different perspectives. So how a student would experience this process, how an advisor might consider this process, how faculty may interact with it, and then also how administrators may see the process as well. So the first is the student perspective. One of the primary reasons, obviously, for implementing the waitlist is better service to them and streamlining the enrollment process. So when a student is looking at course search now on My Neosho, currently they've always been able to see whether a section has been open or full and how many seats are available if it is open. There will now be a new term option. So if a course is actually showing full enrollment but has a student added to a waitlist, it will then show a waitlisted status. So the student looking at the course search, seeing a course showing a waitlisted status means that it's already at that capacity for enrollment and it already has at least one student on the waitlist. So the student then would have the ability to add to the waitlist for any full or waitlisted course if their clearance has been granted or if they're a non-degree student at that point in time. And they're added to the waitlist. That course then only appears on their add drop view. So if they're going in to look at their transcript or pulling their student schedule, or financial aid is pulling a report for that student, or if an advisor is running a degree audit or the student's running a degree audit, it is not going to appear on any of those other views. So that was one thing that we definitely wanted to check in testing is where is this going to appear and how might that impact the student. So it's only showing up if they're on the wait list in the add drop view on my Neosho. So the student who is on the wait list, then when it comes to their space on the wait list, they will receive an automated email when a seat is open, and then they're given that grace period to take action. These are just a couple of screenshots that we've taken during testing to show you how things might appear at different places in the process. So this first one here shows how it would appear if a course is in waitlisted status. It also shows information in the course details. So when you click on that course and it brings up more information there, it'll show that it's waitlisted. This is actually a screenshot taken from a different point in time than these first two. So don't get confused by the numbers there. It's just showing that in this particular case, the capacity for the class is 7. There are 4 people enrolled, but it's in queue to contact the 3 on the wait list who are next. So this could be a situation where there were 7, 3 were dropped for non-pay, but there were already 3 on the wait list. So this would indicate to a student that they would be entering the wait list at that point. And then another place that you'll notice some language that's new or changed is if a student already registered for 12 credit hours for the upcoming semester, if they're in any waitlisted courses, it's going to show as pending registration for that number of credit hours. So again, you notice here it's not incorporating that number of credits into the total. So this is the part that really makes things work very smoothly, or at least a piece of it, is what's called the Usher process. Is an email that is automated when it comes to that student in the wait list. So once an opening is available, they see the first email you see here, telling them where they're at on the wait list, what action needs to be taken in order to guarantee their seat, and what happens if they do not take any action, or if they have any questions, they're given contact information. If nothing happens, if that student doesn't either doesn't check their email, or doesn't get to it within 24 hours, or reads the email and just disregards it, doesn't take any action in my Neosho, they're going to get a second email that says you've been dropped due to lack of action. And that if they're anticipating using that as part of their course load, they need to revisit course search and either look at another option, or they can add themselves to that wait list again, but they're going to the bottom of that wait list due to that failure of action. So from an advisor perspective, working with a student, you would be able to see a lot of the same screen views that we just looked at. You can see the status of the course through course search as well. Just to note again that it's only going to appear on add drop view. So especially if you're an advisor who's using EX a lot, and you're pulling student schedules, or looking at a degree audit, things of that nature, beware that they may be on a wait list for a course that's not showing in your view when you're pulling those reports. Another very key point in this process that needs to be considered for each advisor is that if a student is working with you and you've added a student to a wait list for a course, they are only able to take action when they receive that email to make themselves either current or to leave the wait list if their advisor clearance has been granted. And we'll talk a little bit more about some approaches to that in a couple of slides, but one thing to really be careful with is how you approach that with each student, what your process is, what your philosophy is, and just being clear on how you would treat that situation if you're approaching a weekend. So if a student gets an email over the weekend, that spot is available. Another screen here. So from the advisor perspective, once you've maybe worked with a student in your office to add courses, and then maybe a couple of those are waitlisted, you notice it appears in 2 different sections. So it's very easy to tell which ones are waitlisted versus actually registered. And this would be the same for the student as well if they went to their add drop view. So when you're working with a student who is entering a wait list for a course, the first thing that's going to be extremely important is stressing the importance of checking email. They really need to be checking it at least once a day, probably multiple times a day, if they're genuinely interested in grabbing that spot. The way that the process will work is it will run every 30 minutes to identify openings and contact any students if there are who would be next on the wait list. So that process though is running 24/7 all days of the week. So they could be getting an email at 3 in the morning if an opening became available. So it's really important that they're checking email multiple times a day so that they can grab that spot if they want to. It's also important that they know what the process is once they receive that email. So if they have been granted registration clearance and you've talked to them with that and you approve that, then it's really easy for them to go back into My Neosho and log into their My Academics and make that course active at that point or move to current. But if they've not been granted or remain having the registration clearance, it's going to be important that they need to know that they would either need to request that from you, and again, you'd have to discuss that with them, how you would approach that over a weekend scenario. Also important to remind students that enrollment can change daily. So especially with regard to drops for non-pay as we get closer to the billing deadlines, and then the first week of classes, students are, as we know, very, very often changing sections of courses based on schedule needs and things like that. So it's really important that the email piece is really what drives it all, as well as the registration clearance piece. So have to have both of those, I guess, awarenesses to have it really work well. So for a faculty perspective, you're not going to see any waitlisted students on your roster view. So if you're looking at your roster as you approach the start date for a course, anybody on your wait list is not going to appear there. You can see if you have a number of students on your wait list by going through the My Neosho course search view, just as a student or advisor would. You can see that same information there, but it's just going to be a number. This is just, again, an overview of kind of the logistics of the registration and the Usher product. So again, every 30 minutes, 24/7, it's going to be checking for openings. And if an opening is available, it's going to automate an email to the next in the queue. That individual is given 24 hours to either move to current or leave waitlist. And then an important thing to remind students as well is if they are dropped from that waitlist, if they rejoin it, they're going to the bottom. So that may or may not be a huge difference. It may be a course that had 1 or 2 students on the wait list, or it may be a course that had 15 students on the wait list. One scenario is a little bit more likely than another that you might get an opening for that course. Another thing to remember, so advisors already are aware that there's an add period for courses. So for a full semester class, that would usually be through that first week where they can add courses without instructor permission. So the waitlist process would mirror that. It would be set up so that a student could also join a waitlist for a course through that add period. So once we reach the point in time where we would typically require instructor approval, we would also be looking to cut off that ability to add to a waitlist. And then another reminder there that this option is available only if that registration clearance is granted. So this is how it would, similar to now, if we've passed a add period for a course, they no longer have the checkbox. This would be that difference in how you would be able to view that for courses that might be on different terms or subterms. If you've passed the add period, you would no longer be able to take any action on that waitlisted course. And then administrative perspective, some things that might be helpful. So this could be a new way to look at whether or not to open a new section versus maybe just helping ensure, kind of having that confidence that maybe you're going to cover any drops or no-shows. So if you have, 2 or 3 students on a wait list in the course, we know that, from historically, typically are going to have a couple of drops for non-payment within that, or somebody leaves the course before the class starts. So rather than opening a new section in that case, you may kind of wait for that process to play out, versus maybe you have 15 people on the wait list and have an instructor available to cover that additional section. You could use that information to make that change. So it may also be helpful in assigning load or courses to different faculty members. If you have one that maybe isn't looking like it will make, but you have another class that they're teaching that has a wait list of 15 students, maybe that's a difference in approach on how you assign that class or classes. All right, so realize that was a lot of information all at once, and it's brand new, so I'm anticipating questions. Does anybody have any?
There is not any in the chat, but everyone online, if you would just feel free, you can unmute yourself and ask a question if you have one that's pending.
I have a question, Kyle. How will time discrepancies work? Like if they can get in a waitlisted class, but they've already got a class at that time and date, but.
Yeah, so the way that it will work is it will get, so my Neosho is still going to give the same warnings that it already gives. So if a student is trying to add for a class that is at a current time that they have, or a prereq has not been met, trying to think of some other scenarios, but anytime that they currently would get a warning, it should be set up to run the exact same way. So they would get that same message.
So they could get in their waitlisted class, and then they could also then drop the class that's causing the discrepancy if that's what they chose to do.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, but again, that is going to go back to registration clearance too. So if you're wanting them to have that ability to make that change, they would have to have their advisor clearance or registration clearance open. Yep.
Kyle, we do have one in the chat. It says, does a student who is enrolled but is dropped for non-pay because of some problem have any recourse to get back into the class?
So our current process for that is if a student is dropped for non-payment, at the point that they're able to pay and re-enter or being reinstated, if that course is full, they would have to find an alternative course or an alternative section. So this, my understanding is it would work the same way as our current process.
I will just add to that to clarify. They could choose to go on the wait list, but they would go at the bottom of the wait list. They do not get back their original spot in the class.
Kyle?
Yes.
If a student wanted to take a class that was already full and got on the wait list, could you sign them up for a different section at the same time? And that way they'd be in a section just in case that one got filled up too, and be on a wait list for the other section that might open up for them?
So I've not, we've not tested that. But my understanding is that it's going to give them a duplicate credit warning saying that they've already attempted or been enrolled into the course. I don't know, Marie, do you know, have we asked that of Jenzabar in any of our questions?
I could barely hear Jim. Could you repeat what he was asking?
So yeah, so if a student is wanting to add a course and is able to get into it, but wants to add an alternative section on the wait list, that would be more preferred. Are they able to do that?
If you're asking if they can be current enrolled in a section of a class and then be waitlisted in the same class but a different section, the answer is yes. You will get the message that says, Kyle, you may know the language, but it says something about the course was taken in a prior semester or is currently enrolled in, but you can still do it. You could be in both.
Going back to the drop for non-pay too, I would encourage as a best practice for any advisor that is enrolling a student, even if they're not in a waitlisted course, is to remind them of that process, that we now have a waitlist process. So there very well could be 4, 5, 6 students waiting to take that spot if your payment's not secured. So that could be a help in our billing process in terms of kind of motivating that student to at least set up a payment plan while financial aid's being processed, something like that. But they need to be aware that people could potentially be waiting in the wings to grab that spot who have paid or are ready to pay.
Is the wait list by a specific section? You mentioned, Marie, that they could be enrolled in one section and waitlisted in a second section. So if they hit the top of the wait list and change to a different section, is there any mechanism for then having that spot in the class that they were in, which may or, I mean, does waitlist cover all sections of a particular class or just a specific section?
Kyle, do you want to take that one or do you want me to?
Well, I think with regard to waitlisting being available on all sections, I think our plan is to do that. I don't know if we've talked to the different departments about, having cohorts and whether or not we would open it for those sections, but I think that's going to be probably an ID num sponsor scenario where whether or not they want how they move those students on a wait list. Like I'm thinking for an online section, Marie, if you have 12 students on a wait list and you're going to open a new class.
Right, that is completely, online is completely separate than face-to-face. It would be far easier to open an additional class, a section for an online course. But when you have the face-to-face, you're limited. The student picked that because perhaps of the date and the time. And that's what works in their schedule. And so we would have to have another instructor available on that date and time. So it's not impossible, but there's more hurdles to jump through for that ID num sponsor or the supervisor in order to get that class opened. But I thought, and I may have misunderstood what Ruth was asking. Ruth, were you asking if they are currently enrolled in one section and waitlisted in another section, if in the one that they want to be in, they get a seat, if the system would automatically drop them from the other? Or did I misunderstand what you were asking?
Well, my question was then, is there a link back to the spot that they just vacated to make it available to a student who's on the wait list for the other section? Does that make sense?
Yeah, the answer to that would be yes, with the service that Kyle talked about running every 30 seconds, or 30 minutes, sorry. It's going to drop students who have not taken action and then notify the next student on the list. So anytime a seat becomes available and there is someone on the wait list, they would get notified in that process that runs every 30 minutes.
But can I follow up on that?
Sure.
the student isn't automatically dropped from the one that they no longer want, right? Or are they? If they get into the waitlisted one, you as the advisor still have to drop them from the other one?
Either you as the advisor or the student, if they have reg clearance.
Okay.
They would have to, in that scenario, if they have the class they want, but they're waitlisted and they take a second choice, in order to become current, they would have to drop the one that's their second choice if it's the same class.
Mm-hmm. Okay, but an action has to be taken. The system doesn't just automatically recognize anything about that.
I believe if it's the same class, you cannot be enrolled current in two sections of the same course.
Mm-hmm.
So you, in order to be current, in order to take your seat, you would have to first drop the second choice date and time that you did not want.
Okay.
Now, Jim, in the scenario that it's two separate classes, you absolutely would need to remember to go back and drop the class that you don't want any longer.
Right.
It is a manual process in both instances, but in one instance, you can't actually take the seat you want without dropping out of that other section.
So best advice to a student would probably be you recommend that they go in and drop the class that they're in now and then go back to the wait list and accept the offered class. Is that correct?
I mean, there's going to be multiple ways that can be approached. There you may have a scenario where if they're close to max load too, that they may have to drop before they can add. So it kind of goes back to, whether or not you want to make the drop first or make the add first. But in any case, you're going to want to make sure that it's taken care of if they're making any changes.
But they have 24 hours to do that, right?
Right. Yep. 24 hours from the time that the email was sent, not that they read it. So another thought occurred to me, just another point that could be added to the ID-num sponsor perspective is, if you are adding another section, if it's a face-to-face, but it's not going to be at the same time, if you're the supervisor for that full waitlisted section, you could use this process to pull that list of students and contact them about the new time and date availability and see if there's any interest in moving to that.
Kyle, do you know if there's any way to change the 24-hour window to 24-hour like business hours or anything like that? I just get a little bit concerned when I think about trying to enroll in a class during the weekend and, maybe permission wasn't left open and they can't get in. I don't think it would happen that often, but.
I don't know if Jenzabar allowed us to differentiate that way. Unless, Marie, you have a different answer. I thought that we had to set a number of hours. And we had also, so because of that, we had also talked about extending the number of hours out to cover a weekend. And we thought that would be too lengthy, that it wouldn't really speed the process along very well. So that's where we settled on 24 hours, but it can be changed. If we wanted to go to something more like 48 after we have used this process, we can work with them to adjust that.
Kyle, I think you answered that question. I was partially listening, and I heard you defer to me for something, but I think maybe you answered it afterwards.
Did you know, Marie, if Jenzabar allows us to set business hours instead of clock hours?
No, the only thing that we might be able to ask about would be not running over the weekends, but I don't know if we can define that or not.
Okay.
And that could very well solve the whole weekend dilemma if that's possible. So that is something we can ask. There is a question in the chat, and I was trying to get the answers to that question. So the question is that what are the payment dates for summer and fall? So the must pay date for summer is May 15th, and the must pay date for fall is July 25th. I do remember Patty sharing that when we open enrollment for fall this week, students can go ahead and get signed up on the payment plan. So that is important to know as well.
Hey, Marie, sorry to bother, but to jump back to what Andrew was saying, and Kyle, I completely agree with the weekend thing could possibly be a problem if instructors didn't grant permission, etc. Excuse me. I don't have much of a voice. However, in some of these cases, it could be very last minute, like the last day to drop, the last day to add. You know, I think we're kind of looking at it as a far out waitlisted scenario, but it really could be a right up to the last minute. And so if we, could that be a problem too? Does that make sense?
Yeah, I see what you're saying. So yeah, as you get closer to crunch time, you know, the student may have a little bit more urgency to add that. But I really think it's going to go back to the way it's currently set up. Each advisor kind of having a clear philosophy, almost like an instructor would on a syllabus, that they can communicate to a student saying, you know, if you don't want to leave a registration clearance open, just being clear about that and saying, you know, you could get this email. Maybe you only allow them to join the active course if the registration clearance is granted, which in case they would have to follow up with you first. So, I mean, yeah, the first week or the week going into the last day to do that is probably going to be a little bit more time sensitive, but I think it's going to encourage a student to be a lot more
Proactive.
sensitive to that. I mean,
hey, so can we tell on our end if a student goes in and like, excuse me, for example, let's say I leave my permission open,
Mhm.
and a student decides to go in and change everything on their schedule, whether it's a wait list or not, and then comes back and say, oh, look, I didn't get advised right, I'm not going to graduate. Do we have a way of knowing if they changed their schedule on their end or if we did?
I have to ask registration on that. I know they can tell how it was registered, but I don't know if it's to that level.
And it is a temporary thing. So you can only see that information until a recalc is done. And I believe the recalcs are done daily now. So it would be very difficult, I believe, to go back in and know if it was the student or the advisor, especially if it wasn't caught within a certain number of hours.
And one approach, Mindy, that an advisor could use, if you're not currently leaving registration clearance open for students, I'm not advocating that you need to change that approach. One approach that you could take, if you're not currently doing that, is not leaving registration or not adding a student to a wait list if they're not a student that you would trust leaving the registration clearance open. Does that make sense?
Oh, absolutely. I feel like mine kind of changes. Like I'll go in and look, and some people have grant next to them, some don't. And then that kind of feels like it changes sometimes. Like even, and also some of us have, there's like, in most of my kids, if they have me, they also have a STARS advisor. They also have, you know, they might have 3 or 4 advisors. So how do we know another one might not go in and turn off registration clearance because they're worried, you know, I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, we do have the scenario currently where we have multiple advisors for a student. So as long as they're getting any advisor clearance, they would have that ability to make a waitlisted course current, just like they do to change their schedule.
Or somebody could go in, because I've ended up leaving mine open because I don't always know, like, well, did Dr. Yuza leave it open for a reason, or did STARS? So I just kind of, I never used to leave my permission open, and now I do, just because I'm just not for sure. So we might want to look those students of ours that do have multiple advisors and make sure we're not turning off permissions in case somebody else, because I have some kids that I'm listed, but they only go through STARS, or vice versa, you know, so I don't want to mess up something that STARS is maybe set up with them in regards to permissions. So
right. Good questions.
A question. Okay, the system automatically sends an email out to a person on the wait list when there is a position open. Say that occurs at 5 o'clock on Friday afternoon, and the student sees the message at 5:15 and responds to it. Is that response picked up in some automatic way, or does an actual physical person has to say, okay, I'm putting you in this spot? In which case there might not be anybody there within that 24-hour time period. Does that make sense?
It does. So yeah, if a student gets that message after business hours, as long as their clearance is open, or if they're a non-degree student that doesn't require advisor or registration clearance, they would have the ability, following those instructions, to log into their My Neosho and register themselves currently into the course without having to go through any office. Any other questions on waitlisting?
Kyle?
Yeah.
What would you say to creating a handout that said, in this situation, you've been placed on the wait list, this is your action plan, and then it would just be very basic that said, you'll get an email, yada, yada, yada. I personally would likely leave my registration clearance open if I had a student on wait list, because I would have already, I have a small number of advisees too, but I would have already had that conversation and realized that they clearly aren't able to do a different class that might have an opening, or they just want the first available and they'll make it work, or whatever the scenario is. Mm-hmm. But I could see that definitely happening where I might be unreachable and unable to flip it on for them. So like, I personally would leave my registration clearance open, and I would implement a handout in my advising sessions with a student that said, okay, I am placing you on this wait list for this class, like maybe have a fill in the blank. And then it even said, yada, yada, yada from there on out. That way we tell it to them and it's in writing.
Yeah, I certainly see, especially with the kind of the standard process, the step-by-step how it would work. That could be something that would be easily worked up and could be distributed to all advisors. As far as each individual advisor's approach, I would encourage you each to do that on your own, and maybe have your own philosophy or approach to that for your department or for your group of advisees, and handing that out individually with maybe your contact information specific on it. But yeah, I think it could easily be developed for the, this is the timeline that you have, this is what's required. That step-by-step process could easily be turned into a handout.
Okay.
Any other questions on waitlisting?
There's nothing else in the chat box at this time.
All right, we shall move on. I do anticipate we'll have more questions as we go through the process and it's made live. So as you encounter those questions, please let me know. We can work through those. We may have to make adjustments after we've gone through a semester of it. It's quite possible. So we'll probably be looking for your feedback on that as we approach the spring enrollment period. So we have a few minutes left here. And as you see here, there's going to be some face-to-face sessions on this. There's one this afternoon in Ottawa. There's a couple. I'll be in Chanute tomorrow at 11 and at 3. So realize we're not going to be able to hammer this all out in 15 minutes. So if you do have additional questions, please join me at one of those. If either of those times don't work, just send me an email and I can work with you to get some information on it as well. So this also has been something that's been in the process for a couple of years. Many of you are already familiar with the pilot, where we're using not just placement scores, but also high school GPA and GED completion information and some of the factors associated with that for placement over the last couple of years. And with the success of that, have incorporated that into a new approach for placement for college level math and English. So I like to think that, you know, this little snapshot of all of the students is their different reactions after their placement test over the last 15 years. You have some students that see that and think, I don't think I should have scored into that. You have a couple of others that are surprised and look over at mom and give a thumbs up because somehow they did really well on the test. So then you have others that are concerned about what they just placed into. So hopefully the new process kind of provides some more options to make sure that we're doing the best job we can at accurate placement, which was the goal all along. So what is the same as our, I guess, current or previous process? Students still are going to have to demonstrate proficiency for English and math enrollment. So even previous to the pilot over the last couple of years, we were using a placement test. With the pilot, we were using placement tests, sometimes in conjunction with some other factors. So we're not going away from requiring some sort of proof of proficiency. We're still using that. We're also still using ACT, SAT, or AccuPlacer as long as it's within 3 years. Those are still acceptable measures for placement. Also the same as the pilot is if you have that 3.25 GPA or an equivalent to that we had set on the GED test, you would place into higher college level with no placement testing required. And then students just below that can still be considered with those other measures. So some major things that are different with the new approach to placement is now we're giving students the option to use any of the 3 placement measures. So rather than our mandatory placement policy being a test with the pilot option, we're now saying these are your 3 options, either high school transcripts, GED test scores, or your placement test scores. And we're actually moving more towards encouraging that evaluation of the high school or GED information if they have that and it meets the requirements. We're encouraging that first before testing. Students can also still use a placement test in 1 or more areas to improve their placement if they wish. So say they provide a high school transcript and that places them into an intermediate algebra course, but they feel pretty confident in their ability with math that if they took a placement test, they could prove that. They have the option to do that with that 1 particular section if they wish. Another thing that's different, Compass and Asset are no longer accepted. So those both were due to phase out of their 3-year window in December anyway. So with the new policy going forward, we decided to go ahead and take that out since there was only a couple of months left on that. What's different from our previous pilot? So remember, the pilot was using high school and GED information for college level placement. Now this policy is going to use that information all the way down the spectrum. So even if you're below a 3.25, we can still use your GPA for placement into college courses. It may be intermediate, it may be beginning level, but we'll use the GPA to determine that. No longer will require a set list of advisors for approval. No longer requires the testing or the secondary approval for those students who are considered marginal just below that 3.25. And then it no longer requires the pilot tracking codes on registration forms. So any of those who have been involved with the process already know that that's really streamlining the process and removing some of those extra stops for students to get enrolled. All right, just looking ahead here to see where we're at. So some of the logistics of it. So we still have the 3-year limitation on all of those options. So if they're providing high school transcripts or a GED test and it's outside of 3 years, we're still going to ask that they kind of refresh their information with a placement test to give us a more recent view. The placement task force is currently working through some of the logistics with it with regard to getting access for some of the advisors to access Laserfish, to view high school transcripts that are already on file. Also trying to locate an area in EX so that we can input that unofficial GPA, because we are going to have a lot of current high school students that are engaging in this process, and trying to build in a way that My Neosho can read that as a prereq so that it streamlines that registration process. So still working through some of the kinks on that. Hopefully we'll have that updated soon, and we'll send out more information on that. Some best practices and strategies, just communicating, getting used to communicating all of those options up front prior to requesting test scores, or just referring back to test scores as your first step. And then if you do have a student who's just walking up to you with a test score, maybe just making sure that, again, you communicate those options, because you're not sure necessarily if where they had tested or who had set them up maybe has gone over those options as well. AccuPlacer does have some questions built in now that should provide that information self-reported on their placement test sheet, so that you can at least use that as a discussion point. They would still have to provide that high school transcript as proof, though. Encouraging students to be prepared with that for their advising or enrollment appointments. This will really be especially key with Panther enrollment days, making sure that they have all of that with them, so the advisor kind of has everything in front of them, prepared to use any of those options for enrollment. And then having the placement guide saved or printed at your desk to distribute reference for enrollment. I'm actually gonna try to exit here and show what a couple of those things look like. So this is what went or was presented in the board report last time. So this is the language that will be updated to the college catalog. Has all of the specific requirements for a transcript or a GED test to qualify. And then as you go down, you notice the grid, if you've used the college catalog before, looks very much the same. Basically what we've done is we've eliminated, as I said, the compass and the asset, and we've input the measures that we can use for high school GPA or GED test. We've also changed some language in here. So obviously if a student also has completed any of these courses, that qualifies them, if they've passed it successfully, to move into the next level without using any placement measures. So that will be updated to the college catalog. The other thing that I will be sending out is just a placement guide that can be handed out to students. So it's organized just a little bit differently. It will have a link to the college catalog so they can see all of those specific requirements, but it kind of breaks it down into option 1, option 2, and then option 3 is all of the different tests. So it's maybe a little bit more user-friendly for the students, so they can go directly into what option they're going to use instead of looking at the giant table. And you can see, especially with the option 1 and option 2 now, it kind of stratifies their enrollment. So if they're presenting a less than 2.0 high school GPA, then their enrollment in math would be beginning algebra, writing fundamentals, reading would be reading proficiency. Remembering that as any student would be able to use a placement test for one or more of these areas if they felt more proficient, to try to demonstrate that. And then as long as they have above a 2.0, they could go into that intermediate 100 level algebra, pre-comp, or reading. And then with a 3.25 or higher, outright, they can go into the college level. Again, similar to the pilot we've been using. And then the streamlined part of what we were calling multiple measures is now, if they can show that they have at least a 3.0 overall and a 3.0 in the subject that they're wanting to enroll into, they can also qualify that way. There's the component that for the GED, so the options there. And then these are all of our already approved placement tests that can be used. So it just breaks them out by test here so that a student can go directly to the test that they've taken and see how that would be used. And then similar to what we've provided in the past for AccuPlacer prep is just some brief information about what to be prepared for, how long the tests are, what it contains, just a kind of a brief summary of that, what they can use, and then a link to the AccuPlacer website has some practice tests that they can access. They also have a study app that they can download, and then there's always the standard Khan Academy or other resources that you can go to on the web to practice certain content area. But this will do a really good job of telling them kind of what's expected knowledge on the test. So having this kind of on hand to be ready to visit with students about and kind of show them the different options would certainly be encouraged so that they can see all of the options in front of you and kind of demonstrate maybe which would fit them the best. Similar to when a student has presented 2 placement scores in the past, maybe they've done ACT and AccuPlacer, we would still allow a student to use whichever option might be a better fit for them. So if they have a ACT score that says pre-composition, but their high school GPA says Comp 1, a good advising practice would be to display that to them and ask them maybe which one they felt more competent taking, which is kind of what we had been experimenting with the pilot, is presenting those options. So I realize I did a poor job of leaving time for questions on this one, but as I said, we'll have a couple of on-campus sessions throughout this week, and then if you have additional need for your department or you individually one-on-one, just send me an email and let me know. We can follow up with you that way as well.